Elias Mercer thought, for a brutal instant, that he was riding straight through a storm of manure. The reality was less picturesque. The dust kicked by his mare seemed to be clearing the road for whatever luck had left him, if luck ever came at all. The irony was not lost on him. 5 years behind the bars of Fort Marlowe Penitentiary had taught him that fortune was a capricious thing. And on the blistering afternoon, he reached the outskirts of Redford. It was testing his patience. Redford lay in the wide plain like a watercolor left in the sun. Faded paint, warped plank sidewalks, and signs that creaked when the breeze pushed at them. Horses dozed in the heat, their flanks heaving, and cheap tin roofs shimmered under a merciless sun. The smells of boot leather, tobacco, and sweat stitched themselves into the day. Elias felt each one as though it belonged to someone else's life, a life he used to have and might never hold again. He dismounted outside Granger's saloon, his boots hitting the packed dirt with the tired sound of a man who had learned to measure every step. The clothes on his back were prison issue, loose in places they'd been tightened by the years, but his shoulders still remembered how to carry weight. Long months without a razor had given him a beard that hid the pale scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, a souvenir from a night in Dustwell that had rewritten the course of his life. The saloon doors swung open at his approach. Conversations tapered off like a string cut in midair. Every head turned, every face folding itself into various patterns of suspicion and curiosity. Redford was a town where news traveled like tumbleweed, fast and with rough corners. "Thought you might show up," called Silas Granger, the saloon keeper, his voice carrying the kind of judgment that needed no elaboration. "Didn't reckon you'd have the nerve." Elias tipped his hat, fingers rubbing at the hair matted by travel. "Just looking for honest work, Mr. Granger. Ain't here to cause trouble." A corner table erupted into a snort of laughter. "Honest work," mocked Thaddeus Klein, a broad man with a tobacco-stained mustache. "That's a fine joke coming from a man who killed another in a barroom brawl." The label settled on him like dust. Elias had expected it. He had rehearsed his answer in the solitary dark of a cell, had learned to say what he needed to in a tone that would not invite violence. "I paid my dues," he said quietly. 5 years at Fort Marlowe. I want to work." "Trouble?" Thaddeus replied, rising like the smell of stale whiskey. "Finds men like you, Mercer. Best ride on. Don't expect hospitality here." The bartender added, "We don't serve convicts." It was the polite way of being cruel. He tried his luck elsewhere. Henderson's general store, the telegraph office, the livery stable. Each door closed, each conversation faded when he approached. By late afternoon, his stomach was an insistent animal. His mare was lathered and tired. As the sun tipped toward the western ridge, Elias had nearly resigned himself to moving on when a scene at the edge of town stopped him. She stood beside a sun-faded buckboard, arguing with a man in a respectable vest and boots polished too bright for the prairie. Even from a distance, Elias could see the tension in her stance. The way her jaw clenched, the way her hands curled at her sides like someone ready to fight without the benefit of a gun. "Mrs. Hart," the banker said, his voice silky as a noose. "Your late husband's debts remain. The mortgage is due in 6 months. I don't see how you'll manage." "Call me Mabel," she answered without flinching. Her dark hair was restrained beneath a bonnet. Her calico dress had seen seasons, but each patch was sewn with care. "I'll drive the cattle if I must. We'll make the market in Pueblo before winter." The banker, Barlow Whitcomb, smiled in a way that made the coolies around him look warm. "You've perhaps 20 head if the pasture hasn't died outright. I can offer you fair market value." "Fair market?" Her green eyes flared. "Your offer was half the worth, Mr. Whitcomb. Don't insult me." A small boy, sunburned and solemn, stepped from behind the wagon. He hugged a wooden horse to his chest. You could see how the world had taught him early lessons in scarcity. "Mama," he said, but Mabel shooed him with a single protective hand. She was the sort who had learned to be her own husband and banker and carpenter by necessity. Elias found himself walking toward them, despite 1,000 reasons to ride on. The man's smile as he turned his horse felt practiced, respectful. "Name's Elias Mercer. I'm looking for work if you need an extra hand." Mabel sized him in a heartbeat. The green eyes took in his travel-worn clothes, his wary stance, and the distance he kept. "What kind of work?" "Ranch work, fence mending, breaking horses. Don't mind the hard hours." There was a pause that stretched, and then she nodded, almost to herself. $20 a month, 3 meals, and a bed in the loft. You pull your weight, you keep my boy and my property safe, and you keep your past where it belongs. You won't regret it, Elias said, though the promise tasted like river silt in his mouth. Hope not. The curt answer that married need and resolve. The Turner Place, a new name, a new life. The Hart Place lay a dozen miles south of Redford, a house small and honest in a hollow that cradled the valley. The barn sagged in places, and the corral was a sad thing, post and rail leaning like tired men. But Elias could see potential beneath the neglect, the bones of a working ranch, the quiet resilience of a place that needed hands and heart. Tommy Hart, small and curious, stayed at Elias's elbow the first morning, peppering him with questions as the man tightened fresh planks into a fence. "Why do horses sleep standing up?" he asked. "They can lock their legs," Elias replied, hammer tapping rhythm into wood. "Helps them bolt if a wolf or a coyote comes, saves their legs." Tommy considered that seriously, then asked the question every child afraid of monsters asks. "Are you dangerous?" Elias set down the hammer and looked at the boy square. "I was. Did something I regret. Served time for it. I'm trying to be different. Mom says everyone deserves another chance." Tommy's faith was small and stubborn. "Your mom's wise," Elias said, and the boy's grin was reward enough. Work settled him. Pre-dawn chores, mending roofs as the light came, breaking 2 horses that had been wild on the ridge. Mabel Hart became a quiet force, managing accounts by a dim lamp, stitching and cooking, handing Elias coffee in the field with a small smile that warmed his chest. The evenings were gentle, Tommy playing with a carved horse while the adults sat on the porch and traded silence that had the substance of conversation. One autumn storm pinned them in the barn. Rain whipped the eaves and thunder rolled. Tommy slept among the hay. Mabel came in with a lantern, cheeks flushed from the cold. She stood close enough to leak lavender soap into the air. "Elias," she murmured. He heard his name and turned, feeling the crackle of something dangerous and joyful. "What really happened in Dustwell?" she asked. The question was gentle, not accusatory. Elias put down the brush, jaw tightening. "There was a fight. Rufus Keene. He was drunk and mean. I pushed him in the heat of the moment. He hit his head and didn't wake up. I killed a man. I paid for it. I'm not looking for pity." Mabel drew a breath and sat on a bale. "Intent doesn't bring a man back, but I've watched you. The way you're with Tommy, with the horses, that isn't a cold-blooded killer. That's a man who's trying to live another way." The contact of her hand on his arm was a jolt he hadn't known he needed. His 5 years had been filled with isolation so complete, it sometimes felt as if the world had been scrubbed of color. Warmth returned like slow dawn. "I have not had a woman in 5 years, he said, voice low. The confession hung between them. Mabel leaned toward him, the lantern throwing gold flecks in her eyes. "We'll see," she said softly, though both felt the ground shift beneath them. Their closeness knit into small, private things. The way she saved the bigger piece of pie for him, how she hummed to herself as she sewed a torn saddle, his patient demonstrations to Tommy on how to string a lariat, each day folded into the next with the ease of grooves worn into wood. Redford's tongues were sharp. News of Elias's presence at the Hart Ranch spread like spilled whiskey. At the general store, ladies whispered loud enough to be heard. "Mabel's lost her mind," Pearl Sutter clucked. Martha Crowley shook her head with a mixture of pity and relish. "Who knows what a man like that's doing around a widow and her boy?" Mabel returned with supplies, shoulders squared against the sting of gossip. But Elias saw the tension set in her shoulders. Tommy had become the center of unwanted attention at school. The pastor's wife had made pointed comments about company. Even a mailman spent less time on the porch. Then Sheriff Hester Lane rode out to the ranch, formidable as an iron gate. She dismounted with the careful efficiency of someone used to being listened to. "Mrs. Hart, might we have a word?" she asked. Mabel wiped her hands on her apron. Tommy peeked from behind her skirts. Elias came in from the barn, hands rough with work. "There's been talk," the sheriff said in a voice that could both console and command. "Having a man with your history around families, well, it makes folks nervous." About what? Mabel's jaw was hard as new leather. About the company he keeps. About the books he's known to study in prison. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. A man who worries over law books sometimes makes people uneasy. Elias's face flushed with remembered shame and a new, cooler anger. I studied law in there so I could understand what happened to me. It made me smarter, not crueler. The sheriff looked long at Mabel. You understand what you're risking. Mabel did. She understood everything about the choice she had made, and she also knew that the sorrow she carried outweighed other people's fears. He's part of this family now, she said. We'll protect each other. The sheriff didn't leave, persuaded. Elias could feel the town's gaze like a wind trying to push them apart. Then Whitcomb upped the pressure. He visited with Thaddeus Klein and other men whose smiles had edges. Mrs. Hart, he said, honey sweet, you're coy about marrying into stability. A widow needs protection. Think mostly of your boy. Don't patronize me, Mabel snapped. My boy doesn't need a guardian who buys land cheap. When their threats edged into the dangerous, one man moving a hand toward a holster, another speaking of finding out what kind of influence Elias had on the boy, Elias almost broke. He wanted to strike, to show them the old Elias. The 5 years at Fort Marlowe had not erased all his temper, but they had tempered it. You'll find nothing, Mabel said, stepping between Elias and the men. She spoke with knowledge of the wrongs done to those who had no other recourse. Get off my property. They left, but Whitcomb's smile promised winter's chill would do more damage than snow. Inside, Mabel told Elias a thing he would have thought fanciful months before. Whitcomb's hands reached further than the bank's ledger. She had been saving and sewing and burning, oil late into the night, tracking his moves. She had uncovered evidence, ledgers, transfers, a company called Summit and Vale Trust that was a shell for Whitcomb's purchases. Widow after widow, elderly farmers. He'd always found a way to make the mortgage a noose. Buried among Elias's old papers, books he had read in prison, was a clipping from Dustwell about Rufus Keene and a few notes that suggested Keene was in Whitcomb's employ. Elias had killed a man who, it turned out, had been part of a larger rotten machine. This doesn't make me feel better, Elias said quietly. I still killed a man. No, she answered. But it tells us why he wanted you gone. You're inconvenient. You saw things. They made a plan. Mabel would keep the books, gather more evidence. Elias would not fight in the street, not with fists at least. If necessary, they would take the fight where Whitcomb had not expected to be met, with law and proof. Deputy Jonas Pike, a small, private man who had watched Tommy play and had seen Elias's patience, confided in Mabel. You're doing right by the boy. The deputy's aid would prove decisive, and the sheriff, though skeptical, could not ignore the pattern when Mabel produced more papers, when Deputy Pike found ledgers that matched what she described. When the evidence started to pin Whitcomb down, the ground shifted beneath Redford. On a bright, cold morning, when Redford had gathered itself into a buzz of curiosity, federal marshals rode in with Sheriff Lane at their side. Whitcomb stood on the bank's stoop, indignation painted across his face. You accuse me of fraud? He boomed. The marshals read charges: fraud, conspiracy, extortion. The ledgers, lists of payments, and the name Summit and Vale Trust tied back to him like a bloodied rope. Elias testified. He told the truth about Keene, about the temper, the shove, the fatal strike. He told Redford he had paid in full for his mistake. The bare honesty of his words had a strange effect. The men who had once crossed the street to avoid him now met him with a different slant of eyes. Curiosity then, perhaps a start of respect. Whitcomb was led away. The crowd murmured and then moved through stages from shock to something like contrition. Apologies were awkward and sincere in uneven measures. Hands were offered. The big question that had weighed on Tommy's small shoulders was answered aloud. Do we get to keep the ranch? Yes, came the answer. Elias hugged the boy like he'd been healed. Mabel's face shone, wet with tears, and when Elias asked her something that would change both their lives, she did not hesitate. Will you stay? He asked, not as help, but as more. Her cheeks bloomed at the idea. The crowd, half relieved, half amused, watched as Elias knelt in the snow in front of her and spoke, the words steady as a vow. Mabel Hart, will you marry me? Yes, she whispered. The best, a simple word landed like a benediction. Tommy exploded into a whoop. The town applauded. Love, it seemed, had a way of simplifying things that law and gossip could not touch. 6 months later, the Hart place had another name, rumored gently by neighbors: the Mercer homestead. It was a bright June wedding, with children and neighbors and the fiddle that always seemed to know how to stitch a field of people into one laughing cloth. Reverend Amos Hale had hesitated, then found courage to speak of forgiveness and the worth of honest change. As Elias and Mabel stood under the wide sky to say their vows, Elias felt the long trajectory of his life, Dustwell, Fort Marlowe, the hard miles to Redford, fold into a present that felt like a carved table where they could all eat. He promised to protect, to work, to teach Tommy not only to rope, but to be kind and brave. Mabel promised to love and to stand with him through whatever storms might come. Redford's winters were still hard, and there were nights when the ghosts of the past marched through Elias's thoughts like a parade he could not stop. But the barn had been mended, the corral stood straight, the horses were fed in hay. Tommy learned to read better than most men in town, and had a laugh that broke the steeliest of days. Elias kept reading too, but now he read for more than law. He read the papers aloud to Mabel, practiced writing letters to the families who had been cheated, helping them reclaim their property, or at least their dignity. He taught others how financial schemes were woven. Where once Whitcomb had bought silence with low offers, now men like Elias made knowledge a defense. Mabel and Elias built a life of ordinary miracles: a repaired roof before the first snow, a calf born on a spring morning, a letter from a man who had been helped by Elias's testimony, thanking him because his family had kept their farm. Redemption, Elias discovered, was not an event, but 1,000 little choices: to return a favor, to be present, to not flinch when a memory came knocking. In the hush of an evening, when the valley held its breath and the stars opened like lanterns, Elias would often walk the fence line with Tommy at his side. The boy's small hand in his was a compass. Mabel would appear on the porch with a jar of lemonade, watching them with the kind of contentment that looked like a prayer made visible.